Ladies and gentlemen, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I have the pleasure to introduce to you Professor, excuse me, Thomas Zaricki from the Sociological Institute at the University of Warsaw. His latest book has the intriguing title, Ideologies of Eastness to Central and Eastern Europe. And today, Professor Zaricki will talk about At the Limits of Cressy, an inevitable orientalization of landscapes of Eastern Poland. The floor is yours.
Very much. I was asked to talk namely about Cressy, which I am not sure if everyone knows what is it. It's the Cressy are the limits. Exactly. This is a Polish one of those synonyms of the limits, and it pertains to the very unclearly defined area east of Poland, or even eastern Poland. This is quite a complex question. What's the exact definition of Cressy is? But basically, Cressy pertains to the current day Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. Some people will even include Smolensk region into Cressy, since there was a Polish presence in the Smolensk region, and some include present-day Eastern Poland. And the Cressy is basically, especially from liberal point of view, an politically incorrect notion, because it pertains to this supposed superiority, cultural, economic, even political, over those current nation states, which used to be dependent in many ways from on Poland. But the notion of Cressy pertains in all kind of discourses in modern Poland. So my thesis in the title is that there is this orientalization, which is always implied by any use of the notion of Cressy, which is inevitable. And I am trying to answer why this is inevitable. And my way of answering is what I call structural. It pertains especially to the world system theory, and it has this emphasis on long-term Wallersteinian economic dependencies, in which there's this famous division between core peripheries and semi-peripheries. Poland is here peripheral or semi-peripheral, and I'm here showing one of the very numerous maps, which are interpretations of the core periphery structure in Europe. Just as Cressy definition is ambiguous and clear, in the same goes for the very distinction between core peripheries and semi-peripheries. So many people will not agree exactly with those lines which are drawn on the map, with this famous blue banana and peripheries in the south, east, and even west. Ireland belongs to this western peripheries, or it says orbits of underdevelopment, and the Cressy are even invisible here. They are further east than even this basic west. This is a map from a Western textbook, so which even doesn't care about Poland. But this is this reference to the Middle Ages roots of the current structure of European economic geography. And my argument is that this way of thinking, not exactly this map, but this way of thinking, looking at this concentration of capital, movements of capital, structural dependencies between countries and regions, basically maybe not completely explains, but the orientalization that we are dealing with currently in Poland and other countries of the region, but it's one of the key explanations, key factors behind this, what seems quite often simply cultural processes. So I'm trying to link the economic, political, and cultural dependencies, trying to especially avoid or even criticize what I call culturalism, or discursive reductionism, treating this cultural phenomena as mechanisms, autonomous mechanisms based on some kind of reproduction inner inertia. I am also criticizing old-style geopolitics and trying to avoid economism or economical reductionism, although I may be accused probably of it because this is largely a critique of the culturalist approaches and an attempt to point to those quite often marginalized economic dependencies, which I believe are at the core of the problem. So I'm trying to link Wallenstein with Bourdieu and talk about modes of domination and argue that using the Wallensteinian assumptions, we live in a world when the economic mode of domination is the dominant one. And political and especially cultural modes of domination are subordinated modes of domination, although they can have their own autonomy, which, as I think, for example, the cultural mode of domination has its own strong autonomy in Poland. And this is also the dynamics of the use of the notion of kresy, which may be seen within this autonomy of the cultural hierarchies within Poland. And then, to be very economic, I am stealing a graph from my colleague from University of Warsaw, Piotr Korysz, who is counting Polish GDP per capita for the last 200 years. And he points to the four periods of dynamic economic growth in Polish territories. The late 19th century until the First World War, this is the late late 19th century, then the interwar period, then the communist modernization, and then the current transformation, so-called post-communist transformation. And Poland always reaches 1/3 of the American GDP per habitant, and as you can see, never is able to break this limit. And those cyclical crises seem to fit very well to the Wallenstein's theory of peripheries and semi-peripheries, which experience periodically those global crises, and they pay the highest price for the during those periods of economic downturn, and even this seemingly optimistic periods always end up sooner or later end up in this return to this peripheral poverty. And then I want to point to calculations of my other friends, economists, here from the Deloitte consultancy. Rafał Antczak, who was trying to calculate the total capital stock per inhabitant in euro, which means the assets that actually an average citizen of Poland has. And those calculations diverge very much. Here it's like average Polsk has almost 50 times less than an average German. Here another economist, it says it's about 15. So it's just a shocking gap if you calculate not GDP per capita, but this capital assets. And this inequality creates this basic dynamics between the core of Europe and the peripheries. The peripheries are unable to develop without the constant flow of capital from the core. And my argument, simplified argument, is that this flow of capital is the basis of ideological or cultural domination over the peripheries, because the capital is the basic factor which is creating this assumption of superiority of the core theories, cultures, and political forms, and superiority of inferiority of the peripheral. And this is also one of my examples, specific examples. One of the first Polish banks, Bank Handlowy, based in Warsaw, still exists, founded in 1870, but taken over by American Citibank in 94. And the Bank Handlowy had huge branches before the First World War in Kiev, in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and they have been all gone in 1918 with the Bolshevik revolution. And this is an important argument for me. I will, in a minute, I will mention about the transformation of the status, position, understanding the essence of Kresset after the First World War. And then the internal economic inequalities. This is the map of GDP per working inhabitant in Poland. So basically, Western Poland is wealthier, much wealthier than Eastern Poland, with the exception of Warsaw, maybe Białystok. And this is purchasing power. It's all the same structure. So this is again my economic determinism as a provocation, maybe to some extent, but argument is basically that the inevitability of orientalization of Eastern Poland is largely based on this this inequality, which has several reasons, several sources. Most people would point to the 19th century partition period and argue about some kind of underdevelopment of Russia, while I would rather point to the current dependence on the Western core, especially the importance of the German market, German economy, as the main driver behind the development of Western Poland, because the Western Poland has this proximity to the Western German markets, and the German and more generally international capital usually locates in Western Poland for this very reason of proximity, which allows is the circulation of goods with Western markets. And then my reasoning is that because of this basic economic dependence, we have a cultural compensation, which is emerging in those different scale peripheries. And the narrative discourses of this compensation can be called, as I propose in my book that you mentioned, ideologies of business. These myths, these fantasies about some kind of cultural superiority over the Western core or the core in any scale, that should be seen as compensatory. I quite often self-orientalist, but whether this is self-orientalist or not, it's, as I argue, based on this external mechanism of orientalization or of dependence, economic dependence. And I am arguing that to support my thesis of this basic economic nature of these phenomena, that looking into the past, one can point to periods of much weaker intensity of Orientalism, especially at the times where in the Central or Eastern Europe there existed a relatively strong political or economic actors. So for example, during Napoleonic Wars, where Russia was an important power, this Orientalism supposedly weakened. Then during this late the turn between 19th and 20th century, where Russia was again great economic power, there was this weakening of Orientalism. And then the peak of the Soviet power, this 50s, 60s period, where the Soviet Union seemed to offer an alternative modernity project, also the orientalization of the entire Eastern Bloc, which was much weaker than it is today. And what I'm arguing then is that in Eastern Europe, in place of bourgeoisie, which is weak or even doesn't exist, like in Soviet Union, we have different types of intelligentsia, especially in Poland, or nomenclatura, the political elite. I'm using Bourdieu, saying that there's this economic capital and economic capital elite that is bourgeoisie in the Western societies, and because of the lack of economic capital, we have the substitute elites. Russians have political elite, Poles have cultural elite, and they produce those ideologies of business which are meant to compensate this basic economic dependency on the Western core. And the same phenomena is also repeated on local level. So we have the Russian path during communist finance, communist ideology, but basically strong political capital, strong state, and Polish path with the intelligentsia, the cultural capital, as the main compensatory resource. And what was important during communist period, that it allowed intelligentsia to gain hegemony, as I am arguing, even if the nomenclatura of the political elite was trying to marginalize especially conservative intelligentsia, but the intelligentsia structurally as a group became dominant because its former opponents, landowners of bourgeoisie, were destroyed completely during the communist periods. And from communism, intelligentsia emerges in Poland especially as this hegemonic dominant elite, and it projects these fantasies, these ideologies of Eastness to compensate for the Poland's dependence on the West, on the Western core, and of course to legitimize its dominant role within Poland or within regions, when we look, if we look at regional scale. And I distinguish those three basic ideologies: the conservative, liberal, and this post-Soviet neo-imperial. But when we talk about Poland or Central Europe, it's basically this conservative, liberal ideologies, which are based on the cleavage, which I am arguing is product of the dependence from the Western core. This is the reaction towards the West economic and political also, but primary economic dependence on the Western core, which produces those enthusiastic Euro-enthusiast liberals with the ideology of modernization as Europeanization, and those resisting in one way or another the Western dependence, and producing this ideologies of Eastness in conservative version. Here is some of the characteristics: the conservative modernization, the cult of the, both of these ideologies share the cult of the intelligentsia. Intelligentsia is this essence of Polishness, whether you're liberal or conservative, but you have different heroes. For a conservative intelligentsia member is the Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, Herbert, John Paul II. And there is the cult of this history, previous ancient empires. In the Polish case is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this Rzeczpospolita, the great power, the myth of the Polish Empire, and of course the Kresy, as this eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, is the essential notion based on a very explicit Orientalist scheme, that is this Poland as the engine of westernization of the eastern borderlands of Europe, and the barbarian Russians and all the Easterners who are brought into civilized by the Poles as Europeans. And then there is the liberal counterpart ideology of Eastness, which is of course based on the idea of cultural economic integration, and has this heroes of rather liberal left intelligentsia members, and there is a clear condemnation of the this conservative idea of imperial past, but instead there are some ideologies of Eastness which I also accuse of being Orientalist, especially what I call the new borderlands discourse, which I will talk in, briefly in a second. So when we go to the Kresy discourse, the Kresy on the limits can be considered as this old ideology of Eastness, and a counterpart to the so-called moving frontier ideologies known from other countries. Here I have a slide about this moving frontier. The American moving frontier pioneer it is the Russian ideology of Siberia, deconstructed especially by Mark Bassin, and there's also Prussian ideology of eastern provinces of the Polish-German borderland, which all share this fundamental explicit Orientalism. We have, as I'm arguing, liberal new version, substitute or replacement for the politically unacceptable ideology of Eastness in the form of Kresy discourse, namely this new borderlands, pogranicza in Polish discourse, which supposedly denies or even criticizes those Orientalistic assumptions of the superiority of the West and inferiority of the East, but as I'm arguing, it's also based on those hidden assumptions. But before criticizing this new borderland discourse, I wanted to point to a critical thing as the essence of the Kresse discourse is concerned. So the definition of Kresse is changing. This is a map from internet showing the movement of the Polish borders. So there's this big Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which included most of the common present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, even Latvia. And then there was interwar Poland, so the Kresse moved westward. Now we have only Eastern Poland. But besides this changing geographical definition of Kresse, there was the change of the essence of Kresse in the terms of this economic and political status of Kresse. The Kresse were, for the entire 19th century, were part of the Russian and partly maybe Austrian Empire. But there was heavy presence of Polish economic elite in this area. In some parts of the Kresse, the Poles were the dominant elite in terms of economy, culture, and sometimes even politics as the officials of the Russian Empire. And this produced this basic binary opposition between the Polish lord, Polish nobleman, Polish landowner, and the peasants, especially of Ukrainian, Belarusian, etc. Origin, which still remains as a part of the Polish culture. But then, since the First World War, there was this huge transformation which basically expelled not only most of the Poles from the region, but also the Poles lost all the capital, the ownership rights in this region. And currently, the Kresse are the mythical region which doesn't belong to Poles in any sense, neither political, economic, nor cultural, because the Kresse narrative is basically a Polish one, a Polish internal narrative, and I would even say a intelligentsia narrative. It's a game, intelligentsia game between the conservative, liberal, and other camps of intelligentsia, used sometimes in the national wider discourses, but it doesn't refer to any existing dominance of these regions. Basically, most of the Ukrainian and Belarusian elites ignore the Polish discourses. So they cannot be, I think, considered a classical neo-colonial or post-colonial discourses because they don't work outside Poland, unlike in the period until 1918, when there were the legitimization for the really existing dependence on Polish elite of this area, which is largely forgotten, which is also interesting. This economic presence of Poles in the area, including the Bank Handlowy and other institutions, is largely forgotten. What we concentrate now on, respectively, if you are a liberal, conservative, etc., is culture. The churches, monasteries, castles, and national politics of those countries, nation states, east of Poland. So there is this liberal critique of the Kresse ideology, which I am summarizing here, that it's focused on Polishness, that is explicitly Orientalist, etc. But I am, as I said, I am not defending it, but I'm arguing that it's really not such a evil or really real force, as some would argue, because it's basically an autonomous Polish cultural game, which is now moreover replaced by the new game, this new, what I call the new borderland discourse, liberal discourse based on this idealistic assumptions that we are all one European nation, that borders don't matter, then that there should be a freedom of choice of identities, and peripheries have this, not peripheries, the world peripheries is usually not accepted by this borderlands, have this hidden cultural potential of diversity, openness, ability to innovate. But I am arguing that this new borderland discourse is used by the liberal intelligentsia elites to again first of all, to legitimize its dominant position or privilege of this position, also in the regions, and then to marginalize economic issues and really existing inequalities, which would still exist. Maybe they are not so much that Poles own land in the countries east of Poland, but Poles are closer to the economic core of the European Union, and much wealthier than Ukrainians. And when this liberal discourses of new borderland somehow ignore this economic inequalities and argue that everyone is able to overcome them mentally, at least culturally, and one should just have a positive attitude towards the borderland, towards the neighbors, towards those old people, ethnic minorities. And some of my colleagues from the Institute of Sociology and Philosophy Academy of Science, namely Joanna Kurczewska and Hanna Boyer, proposed a distinction within this new borderland discourse into those oriented towards the border and those oriented the borderland. The border is this backward attitude which perceives border as a limit, as an as the barrier which doesn't allow to the free movement of ideas and people. The good intelligentsia member should see a borderland rather than a border and participate in all kinds of cultural interactions. And I see this as a compensatory discourse, as I said, legitimizing the privileged position of the intelligentsia and in fact legitimizing the economic and other inequalities. And to conclude, few words about the regions. My field work in the especially Białystok, Lublin, and Rzeszów, and my basic finding was that one could distinguish three reactions of regions, regional elites. Especially, I was studying the official discourses of those municipal administrations, and that there's first rejection of Eastness, so those cities or regions don't want to be perceived as Eastern, I mean in Eastern Poland, or redefinition of Eastness as victimhood, the classical Polish strategy, present oneself as a victim, and then the redefinition of Eastness as borderland, that is this liberal attitude of trying to present an image of this intercultural, diverse, open bridge to the east. So the Białystok strategy has this direct reference to this Eastness, chodzący, rising Białystok as a sun, but has this present itself as a gate, the bridge metaphor. The Lublin does the same, but there's always this inequalities somehow popping out, and so it's the Białystok as a gate between East and West, taking full advantage of several centuries of its tradition as a center of transfer of people, services, financial assets, ideas, and modern know-how, moving from West to East, and in the same time as a city opening Europe towards the spirituality, cultural inspirations, and economic potential of the East. So this is the classical Orientalist scheme. The spirituality of the East is traded into this economic assets from the know-how from the West, suddenly appearing in this official discourse. So in Białystok, I found this contest between the old and new Kresy discourse. There's this quite clear presence of the old Kresy idea, even especially promoted by the conservative elite of the Białystok, and there's even the idea of the new Kresy capital, that Białystok, which never belonged to Kresy historically, now will play the role of the new Vilnius, new Kresy capital. There's the Museum of Siberia, the exiled Poles museum, which also refers to this Eastness as even the far eastern Russia imaginaries concert, and this victimization idea. But on the other side, there's liberal elite which promotes the intercultural diversity, cultural diversity, especially the Roma and Tatar memory, less so the Orthodox Belarusian and not at all Russian, which is marginalized. So here is the one of the website of Białystok. You see Marshal Piłsudski, which is the essence of this myth of Kresy, traditional myth of Kresy. Piłsudski was not really related to Białystok, but they try to build this image. So because my time is almost gone. I will just say a few words about Lublin, which is again using this metaphor of the bridge, which with the spiritual influence of the eastern neighbors and the role of this transfer point of the Western know-how and capital into the Eastern Poland and Eastern Europe. Well, the cathedral in Lublin is the symbol of this narrative. When there's this Catholic cathedral with Orthodox Greek paintings, which is promoted in all posters showing this supposed synergy or the melting pot of the Eastern and Western elements in Lublin, and there's the Jewish memory, historical memory, which is used in the liberal narrative of diversity, while the Russian heritage is almost totally absent. Here's a photograph from the Orthodox cemetery of Lublin, where there are a lot of graves of the Russian officials, which they don't exist in any of official materials, including the portraits of the former mayors of Lublin, where the mayors were Russians, are absent. While the last case was Rzeszów, which has promoted itself as the capital of innovation and absolutely rejects its itness. It's the high-tech Polish capital with direct connections to the entire Western Europe and no elements of this Eastness narrative and its official, at least official image. So this would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take the floor for questions or yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a question and a comment. The question would be, how does the existence of EU and Schengen zone figure in all of this? Because, let's be honest, the eastern border of Poland is not as permeable as the western one, simply for the legal reasons. So how does it reflect on all these exchanges and the creation of the new borderlands identity, which you talked about? And the comment is more, I mean, coming more from the historical perspective. I found it very telling. It would be interesting actually to see how does this new borderlands discourse and the emergence of it relate to this trending historiography of empires, which received a huge revival in the last 2 or even 3 decades. You know, this huge interest in the multi-ethnic empires, especially Austria-Hungary, but also the other ones. I mean, the temporal coincidence is there, but it would be interesting to see whether there is some connection between these two phenomena. Thank you.
Go ahead. There was absolutely an important influence of the Schengen agreement on the region. I think it marginalized it further because there was quite an intensive trade and different kind of contact between the Polish and side of the border and the Belarusian and Ukrainian, and it almost stopped. And I learned, especially in Białystok, that just before the Schengen agreement was enforced, there were manifestations, protests, public protests in Białystok against the Schengen agreement, which were never mentioned in the Polish media, the nationwide media. I was just surprised that I'm reading all kind of news and being in Warsaw, I didn't know that there was this kind of resistance, and I think this made the region, the eastern borderland, even more dependent on the EU subsidies. Because the answer of the EU or whatever the officials was to reinforce the subsidies to set up a special Eastern Poland EU budget and finance this underdeveloped region as a compensation for this new barrier which emerged. So I'm looking quite critically at it. That this is this. Then when you criticize, currently in Poland, those dependents you have, the EU pays you a lot of money, so don't complain. So this is, but it's difficult to say about what this negative effects of the EU, for example, as this border issues. So I think it's reinforced this tensions. And regarding the empires, the fashion on empire studies, I don't see so much dependence here, because this new borderland discourse started, I think, earlier. It's already 90s that there was this borderlands identity that was developed by the liberal intelligentsia. But certainly now there could be seen some interaction, or at least similarity, especially in the former Galicia, in the Austrian region, when there was this nostalgia for Austrian empire, and this notion of borderlands probably is more or less can be more or less related to this memory of the Austrian empire as this wonderful multi-ethnic, peaceful, democratic community, while it doesn't work at all with the Russian memory of the Russian empire, which is seen in most of those both conservative and liberal discourses in a very negative light, as oppressive empire.
Small cities on the east of Poland, which actually probably hired some marketing agencies who are writing this whole preamble of the concept of identity. So here's another tension: how exactly contribute in a similar manner.
Yes, indeed. We were discussing this issue, and my impression is that intelligentsia is largely the main actor behind these games, as I call them. And what can be called, especially economic elite, is largely disinterested in this sphere. This is one of the reasons that the economic elite is usually weaker. It's relatively weak, and it does not have this kind of ambitions to influence the imaginary of Poland, to enter into this identity battles. So I think they have their interest, but mostly defined in narrow economic terms, while the territory of this narrative games is left for the intelligentsia elite. So, but my impression, maybe Rzeszów could be, argument for, in your point of view, that there's this decision to project it as an innovation capital and ignore the old intelligentsia narratives of Eastness. But I think in case of Lublin or Białystok, those business elites are simply, they have their interest, but the interests are not placed in this, this narrative, this promotion area. They just lobby for some funds or other questions, but they ignored with this debate whether Białystok should be presented as a Jewish city or Tatar city or rather Polish Kresy capital. This is my impression. Maybe I'm not.
Ideologies of communism or post-communism and nationalism, because it seems that those two ideologies are not specific to the semi-periphery. In fact, you could probably make the argument that they're even more pronounced in the West. After all, it's the UK that's leaving the EU, not Poland. And in terms of communism, well, communism always had a larger, genuine popular following in countries like France and Italy than in any of the East European countries.
I'm not sure if I would argue that that there's the same phenomena in Western Europe. Maybe there's some. We have, I said, the first of all post-communist, but then the cult of the great intelligentsia figures. Great Britain doesn't have John Paul II, so it doesn't have this Václav Havel. All these intellectuals were presented as the fathers of the nation, which proved the vastness of our countries. I think this is slightly different, or maybe you will explain. But it's not just nationalism. It's this idea of this cultural, moral superiority, and this victimization idea that we are poor, we suffered more than you in the West, that we have this moral superiority which deserves respect from the West. I think this is the slightly different than nationalism simply. Of course, it's element of nationalism, but
we are trying to behave as human beings, as good as we can. So that's it.
So I think that press as part of discourse is also used by the ruling party, now by the state. And I think this is also the problem of relations with Lithuania, Ukraine, and so on. And because you said that press are used only in intelligentsia games. So how to refer to this current political situation, your argument?
This can be explained by my argument of the hegemony of the intelligentsia. Since the intelligentsia is the hegemonic elite of Poland, it's able to impose its obsessions and include them into this, especially when you have the conservative intelligentsia now in power. So it projects those images and introduce them, and of course, to this historical narrative, state curriculum, and
I wouldn't call them intelligentsia.
This is the liberal critique. This is the classical game of intelligentsia, that you consider yourself as the true intelligentsia, and you deny the right to be considered members of intelligentsia to your ideological opponents. If you would ask them, they would probably not consider you the true intelligentsia. They would say that you are some liberal cosmopolitan elite member even, but not intelligentsia, but Polish intelligentsia is Catholic, conservative, etc. So this is the internal intelligentsia game.
Getting into a very Polish political problem at present day. I think one last question over there.
Could I just ask if you're describing the liberal version of the borderland discourse of openness, this sense of the strength of diversity and tolerance and positive results of that, but you then see that as legitimizing inequality, but you find it to be specific to a Cressy discourse. How would you then fit into that theory the fact that there's a fairly similar attitude to the Western borders, the liberal intelligentsia discourse to this region, for example, has the same interest in openness, in the permeability of those borders, in the hybridity of cultures, in a cultural past that's different, that's non-Polish. how would you fit that together? Because they're obviously reverse dynamics in a sense. First of all, it means it's not specific to a Kresse discourse, and is not necessarily related to Easterness, or it's Easterness in the other direction. And often it's the same group of liberal intelligentsia that would have exactly the same discourse about Gdańsk and Wrocław as they would about Lviv or Lublin.
Yeah, you're right. It's the new borderland discourse is not so region specific as the Kresse discourse, which has this clear reference to Samaria, but even as I started with the Kresse definition, it's not clear. So no, anything can be Kresse in some situations. So.
I look at my watch, and there might one more remark or question. Thank the speaker for his contribution. It certainly sparked debate. Thank you. Enjoy that. Interesting.
I just learned that this was not supposed to be a coffee break, so let's continue. It's my great pleasure and honor to chair the next session, which will deal with transnational landscapes, and we will have 3 papers in this session. The first one will be given by, I hope I pronounce your surname correctly, Agnès Dudich, okay, who studied history and urban planning in France, and is now a PhD candidate in a program which is located in Košice, in Slovakia, and in Weimar, Germany. This is a study that will present, that will explore the Soviet impact on the Czechoslovak housing history. So she will present a part of her ongoing research. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and also I would like to thank you for the invitation. This paper was an introduction for my research, where I am focusing on the construction of one specific case of housing in Košice. My aim is to shed light to the local patterns of urban development within the wide idea of socialist city and a strong ideological context. So as an urban planner, I focus mainly on the built landscape. My paper aimed to see how the 300 industrial plants, which were implemented in Slovakia during the 40 years that long the state's socialism, changed the urban cultural landscape. So in this presentation, I aim to highlight the importance of the economic structure on the urban fabric, which will change people, environment, and perception of the city, exploring the housing development across the country following a chronological order. So. First, maybe some theory about development. The socialist country, in socialist country, equality was a key word. Each citizen had to have access to services, cultural facilities, and work in an equal way. And work being the main value, its access had to be guaranteed by the state. A dense network of cities should ensure this access and suppress the existing difference between cities and countryside. And this hierarchy within the territory should be replaced by a unified settlement system. This planned urbanization was overlapped by planned economy, and the role of industrial development was to accelerate the economy and the cultural boom, but also strengthen the defensive power by sprawl of activities and consolidation of relations between the industrial and agricultural forces. On an urban level, the development of industries is accompanied by the construction of new dwellings, services, and amenities. The French geographer Jean Labasse resumed that the territorial planning in socialist countries resulted on a brutal industrialization, wide move of population, man was considered as a productive person more than a resident one, and a large urban transformation. So this is for theory, and the reality was always slightly different, and less ideal. So we will see that in the case of Slovakia, the theory helped to develop cities quite equally within the territory, but resulted on various forms of housing development, which changed over the time and had important consequences of people living environment. I'm presenting here 3 main periods of housing development, which can be identified in Slovakia. The state trying over time to restore a balance between the Czechs and Slovaks. So the first period was from 48 to 33, based on a Stalinist model. The communist Czechoslovakia inherited the unequal development between Czechs and Slovak from the first Czechoslovak Republic. After the Second World War, Slovak population was mostly living in rural areas and working in small-scale farms. In contrast, in the Czech part, and particularly in Bohemia and Moravia, people were more urbanized and worked in textile or shoe companies, coal mines, and light industries like porcelain or glass. After the Slovak national uprising and the end of the Second World War, the country was reunified under the particular circumstances. Slovaks were criticized for their collaboration with Nazis during the war, and also political tension appeared between the two capitals, Bratislava and Prague. Slovak autonomy within the reunified Czechoslovakia was questioned by different leaders. Nevertheless, in April 45, when the Košice program was signed, laying the foundation of the new Czechoslovak state, the program guaranteed Slovak autonomy. Headed by Klement Gottwald, Czechoslovakia knew important class struggle, which pushed the Communist Party to embrace the Soviet model, starting by the nationalization of all industries and lands. The Communist Party argued that the national distinction will disappear when Slovakia will reach the Czech socio-economical and industrial level. Nevertheless, the centralized power in Prague did not guarantee to Slovakia an equal treatment. These first years of socialism were not accompanied by the promised abundance. Instead, the economic situation was unstable, the balance between production and investments was not maintained, price rose, and incomes and living standards decreased. The first investments in industry were made for heavy branches and particularly metallurgical industries. The Stalinist period is marked by growth of small cities thanks to the implementation of new industries. They are situated close to natural resources. As we can see here, this is the example of Sacha, few kilometers of Košice. The housing was planned as part of the new town project close to the future steel industry. In red here, it's the only part which were built. And its composition is marked by a small-scale position outside of the urbanized area and predominance of symmetry, traditional grid of streets. The small services and shops as nurseries were comprised in the project. It was the beginning of the standardization and typification of housing. There is another example in Slovakia. It's Nova Dubnica. It is also an example of this Stalinist model. Its construction started in 52, according to the plans of Jiří Kroha for the new machinery industry implemented nearby. These smaller cities saw their urban development influenced by the socialist realism, as well they are close to the city centers and small scales. Socialist realism will have an important impact of further urbanization. On the one hand, they marked the beginning of standardization of architectural elements, which will increase in next years, and on the other hand, the future urbanization of cities will be done in opposition to the new town concept. The predominance of prosperity having not been achieved, the Stalinist period did not affect the urbanization process of the country as much as the following period will. After the death of Stalin and Klement Gottwald, also in 53, a new era started with Antonín Novotný as state leader until 68. He was the guarantor of political and economical stabilization and modernized the country and improved living standards. During this period, Czechoslovakia, contrary to the neighborhoods as Hungary or Poland, proceeded in this period in a very calm manner and stayed close to the USSR and conservative ideas. In July 60, a new constitution is implemented, which starts with these words: "Socialism has triumphed in our country, we have entered a new stage in our history, and we are determined to go forward to new and still higher goals." Since then, the economic and cultural development of Slovakia was managed from Bratislava by the Slovak National Council. This constitution represents a turning point in the development of the country by supporting an equal development between Czechs and Slovaks. As we can see on a map, in 1950, most of the city with more than 20,000 inhabitants are in Czech part of the country. 87% of the industrial production is concentrated there. And in Slovakia, only few cities had more than 20,000 inhabitants, like Bratislava, Košice, Trnava, Nitra, Prešov, and Martin. They are all historical regional centers. As the map shows on the right side, in 1965, 16 Slovak cities have more than 20,000 inhabitants. These cities developed thanks to the impulse of industrial production, not focused anymore only on heavy industry, they are developed several existing but also new factories in the area of textile, machine, paper production or waterworks. This diversification promoted by the state allowed development of cities all over the country. We have here two examples. This is Trenčín and Ružomberok. In Trenčín, the existing textile factory will grow, the arm industry, the city will become famous also for aviation industry. And there is 3 housing estates which were built during these years to host new inhabitants. And in Ružomberok, we can see that these are 3 industries which were implemented in the city. From an urban point of view, 1960s were the golden age for housing construction. The stable political situation favored an open discussion about the future housing estate development with an opening to international trends. Architects argued against the standardization of architecture from the past decade and for higher architectural and living quality. This will also be stimulated by the implementation of competitions between the national design institutes, the Stavo project. The economic development encouraged the construction of large housing estates, which we can identify by their generous urban composition, many public facilities, often individual prefabricated buildings, and given attention to facades. Architects were trying to improve the living environment and also wanted to correspond to people's aspiration to live in modern areas. The main estate which will be built during this period is Terasa in Košice. The new district is composed of 8 parts, each having an own centrality, gathering main facilities, schools, services, and administration. The will of the architect was to the residents to live in garden. The attention gave to green areas and living environment. In '68, the revolutionary spirit and wish to have a communist communism with a human face was stopped also with the Prague Spring and Warsaw Pact. The following normalization period was accompanied by different policies aiming to change the political landscape, and in October, the new federalization law was implemented. On the one hand, the Slovak National Council will gain more authority on the range of areas like education, culture, justice, or trade. And on the other hand, the federalization of industrial and agricultural policies, planning and social welfare had as effect to re-centralize the economy in Prague. Slovak economy helped by state investment undertook large modernization of industries, strengthened urbanization, and implemented new facilities, which will narrow the gap between Czechs and Slovaks. After '68, the technocratic housing will appear in the country, and not only in existing big cities like Bratislava or Košice, but we can see that on the map that many other new cities will reach this 20,000 inhabitants in 80. The population continued to be well spread on the territory. The eastern part of the country also saw newcomers in existing cities like Bardejov, Michalovce, Humenne. And the 70s are also marked by the diversification of working opportunities, particularly with the development of tertiary sector. So the need to build close to industries was not a priority anymore. The improvement of construction techniques allowed, these are the 3 cities I mentioned. These new housing estates were built on greenfield for thousands of residents. Their connection to the existing urban fabric is uncertain. In white, there is a zoom with the connection to the existing grid of the of the city. So in larger cities, the distance from workplace is bigger and forcing people to have longer commuting distance.
It would have been better to have a coffee break before.
The lack of investments did not allow anymore to plan facilities and local services and reduce the overall quality of these districts. To take back the sorry? Maybe. Bad breathing also. To take back the example of Košice, after the glorious expansion of Košice in the 60s, the city engaged the construction of several housing estates in its surrounding areas. Between 76 and 89 will be built in the city 3 new housing estates. It started with Dargovský Hrdinov with 34 inhabitants, which is here in the west. The Košické vládne program, which 28,000 residents, and in 84, far from the city center, will be added Ďachanovce, the last one in north, which is also connected to the city just with one road. Later, the housing estate will be built in lower quality, and the living environment was not as good, and the less money was invested in public facilities. Few public transport connection also existed with other parts of the city and increased density of population. It looks like the planners did not believe anymore in this form of housing in this late 80s. As a conclusion, I would like to highlight that in the whole Europe, 20th centuries was marked by a fast industrialization and following different phases of prosperity and accompanied by a global trend of urbanization. The case of Slovakia showed that on a national scale, this strategy was successful, this Soviet way of having a network of cities. Cities grow all over the territory and narrow the gap also between Slovakia and Czechia. And even the most agrarian parts in eastern Slovakia achieved good industrialization. What can be retained in that is the aim to build a new society thanks to the new urban development was, from my point of view, only a background or justification for the construction of large housing estates. Such estates appear in whole Europe, and therefore the socialist city can be understood on a national scale more than a local one. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Agnes, for your talk and for the perfect time management. And then we turn to the second talk that will be given by Agata Zysiak, a sociologist who is just back to Warsaw after a terrific year at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. Agata is well known for her award-winning book about the Socialist University in Łódź and some other publications that she will also mention during her talk. Agata will try to answer the question of where is the working class in Poland.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for a pleasure of being here. Thank all of us who choose to be here, not sightseeing Wrocław in this beautiful afternoon. So maybe I will give a short introduction of my methodology and approach, because later I'm going to present kind of a general, even bold argument about symbolical processes, symbolical landscapes, as I deal with that. So it was mentioned, this is a forthcoming book. I hoped I will bring a book instead of this leaflet, but if you're interested, please take some later on. Sorry. The book is titled From Cotton and Smoke, and this is more or less a social history of this strange city most of the people cannot pronounce. If you're not a Polish speaker, highly advise to try Łódź like and take the first word. That's Łódź, or Lodz internationally more known. And this book was based mainly on press analysis, public discourse analysis. By this I mean speeches, city council materials, and so on. However, I recently also started a project on working class and the post-war changes. So actually I gathered the findings of those two projects to present a little more general argument. So it does not work, it does, all right. So Łódź is just there in the middle of Poland, in the middle, contemporary Poland, of middle of Europe. I gave this partition map to show you also the kind of the context of its origin when it was established first as kind of the free economic zone to develop industry in a short period of Polish independence, like semi-independence as the Kingdom of Poland, and later it was mainly textile center producing different kind of textile for the Russian market. And why we are starting that early in the 19th century? Because part of my argument that actually is that actually a certain stable setting of meanings was established already at that time. So we start with the second half of the 19th century, stop briefly on the Revolution 05, and later concentrate on those two periods I'm most interested in, that is 45 against 89, and the role of working class in this kind of symbolical landscape. We can call it like it's a working concept, let's say. So the 19th century, very briefly, what we have to take out of this period is discursive representation of Łódź. And you can take all you know about 19th century peripheral cities, the fast development, the rapid capitalism, all the multiculturalness caused by this rapid development, which was called the Polish Manchester, later often Polish Detroit. But in the press, mainly in Polish discourse, it started to be framed as the alien city, the other city. The city does not fit exactly to our imaginary urbanity, and Polish intelligentsia played here a large role with distancing itself from this very rough and chaotic city. And one of the components between cosmopolitanism, capitalism as such, foreigners, was working class. And very soon, with this rapid development, which really became the place of working class, and it was mainly female working class, which will play the role later. Okay, why Revolution 05 is a kind of the pit stop here. That was the first moment that working class actually came into this public discourse and had to be considered as a subject, not only an object of the discourse, like taking agency very briefly, but changing the meanings for a long time, and which was one of the main centers in the Polish territory where Revolution 05 had consequences and influenced this way that working class suddenly is object of discourse, but it's also a subject on this, let's say, societal level. And we need this part because interwar is, of course, a different period. You can discuss that. But later, the second moment when the working class is entering the discourse, entering the public scene, is 45. And here I need to do a few assumptions, especially I had an impression that discussing the post-war, we're actually still shifting between the revisionist and totalitarian paradigm, and actually there's this conflict. It was not underlined maybe before. I strictly stand against the totalitarian paradigm, and I treat post-war socialism and implementation of this socialism as a kind of modernization. Brutal, not grassrooted, but still modernization project. And one of the most important components of that was validating and recognizing the working class, in which the case is even more interesting, as in 45 this is the biggest Polish city. Warsaw is destroyed. There are ideas that there's going to be a museum of war established and it's never going to be rebuilt, which at the same time fits perfectly for the new narrative. It's a working class city, it can regain the social justice, and speech after speech, article after article, it is pronounced to be the city for new times. But very soon, this imagined new capital, there's of course lots of gossip, because new universities, new cultural centers, even the government that was established first will be moved to Łódź, not to Warsaw, but it never take place actually. From more or less 48, it loses this new symbolical status, and working class still remains as the main subject, the main actor of the social scene. However, it's not longer textile female workers, but rather steel workers, miners, stock workers, and so on. Very soon it occurs also that most of the economical plans keep Łódź. It still has infrastructure from the interwar time. It was not destroyed during the war, which was actually one of the reasons why in 45 is such a vivid and interesting place. But at the same time, investments are not so much needed. Soon it occurs it also does not protest as strongly as the mail industries does. Investments are not flowing as fast as to the other cities. And if you compare the wages among workers in post-war Poland, from the 50s till the 80s, textile workers will be the worst paid and have the least participate in the least manner in the kind of the socialist welfare state. So the privileges are pretty limited. Women rebel mainly in 70s and the 70s and in the 80s, which is called hunger strikes, which can indicate already the character of those protests. Those are not protests based on their class consciousness as much as on their household and what they're gonna feed their children. So in a way, we can talk about this paradoxical status of textile workers during People's Republic of Poland. But still, I would quarrel it's somehow better than what is happening after '89, which loses all its markets historically from 19th century, focused on the East. Textile workers do not protest as hard as their male co-workers, let's call it globally or nationally, and are the least protected groups during transition period. And they also disappear from local discourse suddenly, which is composed of reaction, not sure who. And the especially analysis of the press shows they disappear as a social actor. And suddenly, another completely imagined actor appears in this constellation, which is once again factory owner. The sack-blooded just a decade ago occurs to be entrepreneurship businessman that can feed this imaginary hunger for being a modern, once again, European city. Even the ancestors of one of the main factory owners is interviewed again and showing how it was to build a factory in Łódź, how prosperous which was thanks to the factory owners, not the working class. So we have a complete reverse narrative about the city and its identity. And it goes farther to the pop cultural level, from the city council announcement to the, for example, name of the marathons, which is a factory owner's marathon, not a, I don't know, a textile worker or whatever. So very soon, this social amnesia, in a way, exclude completely the working class, the textile female working class, which also results in the lack of any association, really lots of troubles in reaching now the textile workers to, for example, gather the narratives. And at this point, my paper ends, if you want to search for some information about that, but I would like to add a small and optimistic appendix. As already almost 30 years passed, actually we've faced a revival of this working class identity. It started with rather leftist environments and definitely very narrow intelligentsia-based environments. But suddenly the commemoration of Revolution 05 occurred, framed as a fourth uprising, trying to gather both more leftist and more conservative audiences. Suddenly more books occurred, and just this month there was a new reportage in Czarne Publishing House, which is one of the most popular publishing houses focusing on reportages, published a book about female textile workers, Aleja Włókniarek. I highly recommend this reading. It's written by my friend, and we gather also together our histories of textile workers. And it's still a marginal thing. For example, now in Łódź we have opened so-called new city center, and it's a whole new topic I'm not gonna get into there, but the all new streets were named after the main factory owners' companies. So we have a Gromans Street, Poznański Street, but nothing, only a small, actually very, very tiny street will be named after the piece of machinery, not even one of the professions of the female working class. I'm probably a little bit ahead of time, but actually this is more or less the whole argument I want to present it, and hopefully in the question part I will have chances maybe to give you more detail or quotes from the material I have. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The third talk will be given by Alexander Androszuk, who is a historian at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, specializing in the history of territorial and toponymic reforms in Ukrainian lands during the 20th century. And he will give a comparative talk dealing with the politics of place naming in Poland and Ukraine after 1945. The floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to join this very interesting scholarly event. And I try to be original, and I start with my gap in my presentation. As we've seen here, this title longer than title that you can find in program. I decided to add I'm looking for the most felicitous introduction word to my title of my presentation, so long that I lost it completely. Now I added this word, the landscapes reappropriated. I think that this phrase is helps to make more clearly connection between cultural landscape and place name renaming, and also as well as it underlines the main idea of my paper, of my research. I mean that we can see on some regions in post-war Ukraine and post-war Poland similar process which can identify as about if we talk about toponymical landscape, it can be identified as reappropriated landscape. Of course, the address and communicative function of place names is fundamental but not single. Many researchers emphasized the value of place names, toponyms, as an important part of cultural heritage. Lawrence Berg and Robin Kearns pointed out that place naming plays a key role in the social construction of space and the contested process of attaching meaning to place. Maus Azaryahu argues that toponyms inscribe ideological messages about the past into the many practices and texts of everyday lives, making certain version of history appear as a natural order of things. Sorry, can I use? Cultural and historical geographer Derek Alderman notes, toponyms permit our daily vocabulary, both verbal and visual, appearing on road signs, address, advertising, billboard, on, of course, maps. Place names not only melt history with geography, but also conflate place and group identity because of shared context of using and referring to toponyms. Being a part of the symbolic landscapes, toponyms are included in wider social and cultural contexts. Widespread prevalence and non-controversial nature make them an important tool for imposing certain political and cultural agendas. In this case, toponymic landscapes become an arena for public and political debates. Subordinating of renaming place names to political agenda is clearly visible on those territories that were occupied or transferred from one state to another. As Terentiev notes, renaming of geographical object is widespread practice in societies experienced radical social and cultural transformation. Some researchers describe the most large-scale waves of changing of place names that have been observed in post-colonial and post-socialist countries in the 20th century as toponymical cleansing. In this context, the history of Soviet Ukraine is a good case for study, to study the policy of creating collective identity through the radical change of toponymical landscape. Toponyms have been studied by many researchers, mostly used two research approaches. According to cultural study approaches, the names are considered as historical and cultural artifacts and become themselves the object of the study. However, the critical approach focuses on the problematization of naming, renaming practices, as well as on the role of the place name in national building, and underline how they are rewriting in times of political and ideological change. Traditional focus on empirical aspects predominates in toponymic study in Ukraine. However, the historical context of changing place naming in Ukraine, as well as the Soviet place naming policy, rarely becomes the object of special research. In contrast, the Polish scholars demonstrate an active interest in the issue of toponyms renaming in Poland, especially as regard the territory transferred to Poland after the Second World War, so-called recovered territory, ziemie odzyskane. In my paper, I tried to examine how place naming as a political practice per excellence of power over space, it's term Pinchevsky and Torgownik, has changed cultural toponymic landscape of Ukraine and Poland after Second World War in comparative perspective. Methodologically, the paper is based on a critical approach to the study of toponymy. Such approach can help to compare key points of post-war Polish and Soviet politics toward toponymic, such as political context and reasons of place naming changing, driving forces of place naming changing, principle and criteria used for renaming, institution included of renaming process, etc., etc. This analysis covers only two types of toponyms, denoting a settlement and its part, oikonyms, and names of administrative units. Here I want to say about my second gap in my presentation. I mean some ignoring of visual materials, maps, and picture. I prefer, as a historian, personally, I prefer to work with archives material, archive documents, and I try to make my research based on this material. It is common that after the change of political renaming regime, new power tries to create a new state symbols and to remove evidence of the deposed regime. It is possible to say that any place name change in the USSR were directly related to the ideological, political, and national policy. The place name politics was regulated in Soviet time, was regulated at the highest Soviet level by the decree of the old Union or Republication, Central Executive Committee, and Supreme Soviets. Its change in toponymic landscape usually had a well-planned character, like political campaign, and often covered not only separate region or national republics, but whole country. It can be argued that history of renaming place names in Soviet Ukraine reflected the general tendencies with certain local specificities. The wide-scale process of place naming, place name renaming in Soviet Ukraine began, in Soviet Union began after the Lenin's death. Since 1924, the government was consciously conducting a policy of introducing Lenin's cult in toponymy throughout the entire Soviet Union. In 1924, Petrograd became Leningrad, Armenian city Alexandropol was renamed in Leningrad, etc., etc. In parallel, the names of Stalin, Dzerzhinsky, Sverdlov appeared on the map of the USSR in 1920s. 15 urban settlements received new names in honor party figure from 1929 to 1934. Renaming of cities of Stalinabad, Kalinin, Orджоникидзе, Stalin Square are the most significant of this time. Next few campaigns of large-scale renaming took place in Soviet Ukraine during post-war period. Place name renaming after the World War II was caused by the change of states' border. In mainly concerned the territories that changed the state affiliation. According to the Nazi-Soviet Pact of non-aggression, the Western Ukraine were incorporated into Ukrainian SSR in 1939. In 1940, the Soviet Ukrainian included Ackerman and Izmail region, Bessarabia, inhabited by Ukrainians. After the reunification of this region, the population of Ukrainian SSR was increased by 8 million people, and the territory has expanded to 565,000 kilometers. A new Soviet administrative division was introduced in, and 6 new oblasts were formed: Volyn, Drohobych, Lviv, Rivne, Ternopil, and Stanislav. The main task of the authorities was quickest integration of newly affiliated territories. It was done in different ways: deportation, migration of population, creating of single economic system, and ideological pressure. At the same time, Poland experienced also one of the largest state border changes after Second World War. Researchers argued that the lack of, and now I try to compare process and outcomes and consequences of this toponymical reform in post-war Ukraine and post-war Poland. Researchers argued that the lack of consistent guideline principle of place naming change caused chaos. In this, somewhere one place had 3 or even 4 names simultaneously. For example, the name of Voivodstvo with its center in Gdansk had 4 different names. In these situations, the railway administration, Polish railway administration, and regional railway administration in Poznan, interested in establishing a clear principle for station name changes, organized a commission of revival of Slavic names in this area in April 1945. Many scholars, geographers, historians, linguists, sociologists participated in this commission. It's so worth noting that toponymical landscape of the recently annexed territory of Soviet Union was highly contrasted with already well Sovietized toponymy on the rest region. There were a lot of ponyms that had foreign language origin: Polish, Hungarian, Romanian. Additionally, many names were unacceptable because ideologically there are ideological contexts. Interestingly, in both cases, on recovered territories and especially on territory of Western Ukraine, toponyms of Polish origin were the object of political influence. While the Polish toponyms were restored on the recovered territory, it was massively erased from the toponymic map of Soviet Ukraine. The Soviet model of renaming has established in the 1920s and in 1930s and was also used later. In general, the mechanism of toponymic renaming in Soviet Ukraine in post-war era was as follows. Special commission were established in the district center to clarify the place names. They were preparing proposal for high authorities to change name. This commission considered representative of local executive bodies or local party committees, as well as local land surveyors of the head of propaganda at propaganda department, sometimes school administration, sometimes very rarely teacher of history, journalist. Place name changing procedure in post-war Poland was different from the Soviet order described above. Briefly, the work schedule for restoring Polish name includes 4 steps: preparing work, preparing work and resolution of regional commission, resolution of the main commission, approval by the Minister of Public Administration and the Recovered Territories, and announcement in the Monitor Polski. Academic circles and scholars played an important role in this process in Poland, unlike the Soviet experience. Some institutions in which scientists worked have played a key role in toponymic renaming on the recovered territories just after this World War II. It is worth noting that here are some scholars who personally and due to their research made a great impact on this process mentioned above. On the contrary, in the Soviet model, we rarely notice the involvement of scholars. Significantly, the Onomastic Commission at the Academy of Science of Soviet Ukraine was established only in 1916. As a result, Ukrainian scholars were not engaged as toponymic experts as in carrying out place name changing reform in the first post-war period. Their opinion were taken into account only in few cases. For example, in the case with Vishnevets. Ternopil Regional Executive Committee of the Communist Party initiated renaming the district center Vishnevets, which, according to local authorities, bore the name of traitor and hangman Ukrainian people Yerema Vishnevetsky. Therefore, the fact that the village, known since end of the 14th century, gave the name to Vishnevetsky family and not vice versa was ignored. The village was not renamed. Some in my presentation you can see courses of this toponymical reform and main steps of this toponymical reform in Poland and in Soviet Ukraine. As we talk about post-war Ukraine, according to the handbook, the administrative and territorial division of the Ukrainian SSR in 1944, about 5,000 renaming were carried out in Soviet Ukraine. All the renamed toponyms can be grouped into several categories. It's very important. And this is example of pages from Відомості Верховної Ради, the periodical issue of Supreme Soviet, Ukrainian Supreme Soviet. Okay. Category types of toponymy were renamed. We can see here many toponyms that have Polish language origin. And my conclusion, I'm sorry, the comparative analysis shows that place names change on the recovered territory in Poland and in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic were caused by demands for the rapid de-Germanization and Polonization, as well as for Sovietization of new lands. In both cases, the political purposes were legitimization and facilitation of new territories integration. However, this process had some principal differences. Place name changes in Soviet Ukraine aimed to denationalize and alienate the pre-Soviet toponymic landscape, as well as to promote new political order and communist pantheon of heroic events and personality. By the contrast, Poland was experiencing the opposite process, nationalization landscape and restoration of remembrance or the old place names. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Alexander, and thank you to all speakers for these comparative, diachronic, and transnational insights into the various regions of East Central Europe. And now we have about 20 minutes for discussion, and I'd suggest that we gather questions so that we are better in time. Who would like to kick off? Please.
Question goes to Agata, kind of supplements the question, where is the working class? What is the working class? I'm mindful of Norman Davies, who argued in Heart of Europe that the best people in socialist Poland were actually the worker peasants who were having, had a job as a worker, but also had plots of lands of variable size where they could produce. Now this is interesting because it's really an existence that we usually associate more with kind of early industrialization stages. Is there something to this? Is this a stable figure, or is this a transitory phenomenon?
And then also to ask you another question, could you tell us a bit more about the driving forces behind the processes that you mentioned after 1989? I mean, who is really responsible for this rediscovery of factory owners and what? Do you want to add another question to this session? If not, then I'll just give you the floor and the opportunity to answer.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I didn't want to get too much into detail because we would end up a little bit maybe too enthusiastic about which case in general. So definitely we're not talking about the coherent working class. But if we're gonna argue that anywhere in 45 Poland, the year of 45, is there any place where it's working class? That would be probably Silesia with a different history, and Łódź, because still the consciousness of also local identity built on the Revolution 05, interwar strikes, clashes between socialist and NDEC fraction in the city council and so on, it all shaped the kind of the myth of the place. And ruralization, which was extremely intense process in whole Poland, still there had this small, how to call it, maybe island of legacy and continuity. Of course, we have the dramatic social revolution, because we can frame Second World War as this kind of the process, and both German and Jewish population, who consisted of almost a half of the population before the war, disappear completely. But still, the Polish working class is the stable component and kind of it drives the continuity of identity, which is later restored very, very intensively, both by the public speeches, the press materials, and this is a material my conclusions are based on. And probably if we'll go to the archives and compare, for example, and I did that as well, the rural migration is very, very strong, but the story that is offered and many people identify with is a little bit different than in other or smaller cities. So definitely there's no continuity, also from 60s and 70s, when also textile industries relocated to smaller towns. Probably we can talk about the rapid change in working conditions, like for example the so-called chłoporobotnicy, so the peasants who are just driving to Łódź and work there and get back to their household in rural areas. But at the same time, on the symbolic level, it's very coherent construct and is played maybe at the certain points even with a very weak substance in the true social structure. Yeah, that would be more or less this. And the factors, yeah, so once again, the argument I'm using is is layered or maybe based on mainly discursive production. So after 90s, it's mainly press discourses and city council especially. Many researchers also before argued that there's a point of drawing a continuity with interwar Poland. So there was a Second Republic, now a Third Republic, and we're getting back to our true identity after a second occupation, that is Soviet occupation, and now we can regain our true nationality. And one of the components of that was getting back to this interwar narrative or the imagined bourgeois or factory owner. There was also a very powerful construct of so-called Loddermensch, which was actually first appeared around 80s and 90s of 19th century, which is pretty similar to Manchesterum, like the Manchester modern way of living, but in which it was, as in Manchester case as well, it was pretty ambivalent. On the one hand, it was this Novorish businessman who's establishing a factory in the city, but at the same, he's ruthless. He's atheist, probably cosmopolitan, without any rules and moral core. So after 89, the Loddermensch is back, but it's a completely positive figure. He's just entrepreneurship. He knows how to take care of himself. And if we consider what's happening in this deindustrializing city, this is almost cruel figure to propose to all these textile female workers who are without jobs and the factory is being closed down, while at the same time the city council, the press materials, the whole public discourse concentrated of this Loddermensch figure that's getting back. Yes, so this is mainly the forces that are here, and at the same time those are the materials that simply served for a database for this research. Thank you.
Thank you. I see two more questions at least. Mirjaleka first.
Thank you. I have a question to Alexander. I was wondering about the linguistic part of the renaming of cities, because of course the proximity between Ukrainian and Russian seems to make it easier to shift from one name to the other as compared with the names in the western parts of Poland, which had quite different names. And were philologists involved in the process, and what role did they play? And how important was the fact that many places in today's Western Poland had German names that were of Slavic origin? And well, of course there's different types of renaming, as you mentioned, ideological ones and ones that were names, well, names that had already circulated parallelly. So could you please show us or tell us a little bit more about the linguistic side of the change of toponyms?
And I suggest that we gather, so the other question will be asked by Stanley Bill.
Thank you. My question actually follows directly on from Miriam's question. For Alexander, could you tell us a little more about the dissemination of these names, the new names? Now, obviously in some of the cases you're talking about, you've got in a large part new populations who hadn't lived in these cities before, in which case changing the name seems to be a relatively simple process. Do you know anything though about the case where you had large numbers of people who had been living there before the name change, and how the new name is disseminated? Is there any social history on that, or records of people whether they're using or not using the new names? And secondly, the material history of those name changes. That seems fascinating. We'd be interested if you happen to have looked into that or knew anything about it. I mean, how all the changes of signs or previous documentation that refers to the old names, and obviously all kinds of material changes that would be involved. So there's two sort of interrelated questions that follow on from the previous one.
Okay, and there will be one more question asked by Kuba Gawkowski.
Thank you. I have a question to Agata. You mentioned briefly this 1905 anniversary celebration, and if you can elaborate on that, so the idea and how do you see it, like if it was actually successful, if it's not, and also you mentioned this dynamics. So this political dynamics that is actually organized by the left sort of groups, but then also who are they trying to attract with this, and can you just speak a bit about this?
and I will just take the freedom as chair of this session and ask a question to Agnes. I wanted to push you in another comparative direction and ask you about the role of the post-German infrastructure in post-war Czechoslovakia, because there was a lot of legends and myths in the early post-war period in Czechoslovakia related to the post-German houses, post-German infrastructure, and so on. But it was sort of whether they had a productive or rather destructive impact on urban planning, and what is the current state of affairs? What do we know about the real impact of this post-German infrastructure on the urban development in Czechoslovakia? Is there any new research on it? Okay, so first, Alexander.
Thank you very much for the interesting question. If we talk about role of scientists and linguists in this process, we have a different picture if we analyze Soviet time and post-Soviet time, because in Soviet time communist ideology dominated under another factors of many things, many reforms. And as I mentioned about in my presentation, Toponymical Commission in Ukraine was established only 1960, but Soviet reform happened just after Second World War caused next some reforms in toponymical landscape, which was characterized as epidemic renaming, because in the middle of 1950s in Soviet Ukraine, many toponyms which was connected to the name of living person was changed. It was caused only political agenda and fight between Khrushchev as political leader and anti-party groups. If we talk about current situation and post-Soviet situation, for example, in Ukraine, role of scientists, linguists is increasing. We have recently we have many controversial and many discussed process of decommunization, toponymy, and in this process many scholars was involved. I know about historian, my colleagues, who propose for the new name or propose old original name for some city. Some of them was accepted, some of them no, and it's my opinion situations like this. According to population have it used a new toponyms. I would like to mention a special case, Crimea, when Tatar population was deported, and new Russian language, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking population don't understand place names of the city where they settled. Such similar situation can see in recovered territory, as Vladislav Pulatsky, who was involved in this process in post-war Poland, noted that when Polish settlers from the central province and from ex-Polish territories annexed by Soviet Union come to recovered territory, they found themselves surrounded by German place names among almost everything, including signboard of the station and town office road, and store signs of billboard was written in German, and it was make this psychical disorient. The population was disorient. Have disorientation. Sorry, by this environment. Sorry.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for the question. So first, the original event that took the form of pretty rapid strikes and rebellion inside the city at the first time very spontaneously, and it was even a kind of surprise for local elites and later also for Warsaw intelligentsia that something like this is happening. Also, the protests themselves were like much more modern than the previous one, where, for example, workers voted among themselves to elect the king to like help them prospering. I mean, the strike of '82, and later. After that, we can clearly see, analyzing press discourses, that before the revolution, usually there's a very paternalistic discourse of educating the masses, describing these barbarian crowds that flee the streets after the shift in the factory and so on. And suddenly after that, after all, also the 2 years of internal conflicts, when the diffraction of more nationalistic and more internationalistic divides, and there are actually murders taking place among the workers, depending on their more national and more international views. After that, they became a subject of discourse, like the citizens of the city with whom interest you have to take into consideration. So this is one very important moment on discourse level. From the more conscious processes, we have lots of testimonies from that time, because later after 45, of course, revolution was a very important reference point, so lots of archival work and lots of oral histories projects were taking place, gathering like how the events exactly worked. You can see that it was actually absolutely revolutionary experience of seeing, for example, your profession and your situation being described by text. I'm not talking about illiteracy, which was very high, but the people who were also later instructed by their literate colleagues, that we became the humans. This is something that repeats in the stories again and again. And what happened in the 2000, actually the origins were pretty leftist. I mean, it was Krytyka Polityczna, political critique, leftist, Warsaw-based, how to call it, intelligentsia club that had a club, a Świetlica, so-called, a kind of cultural center in Łódź as well, and gather mainly leftist, central leftist activists who started to get back to this event. But very soon it occurred, as Łódź struggles a lot with some kind of a clear identity and story that could be told and be inclusive. The city council engaged, depoliticized the whole event, framing it rather as a fourth uprising and fighting for independence under the Tsarist imperial power and so on. And now, actually, it's still a little bit unstable. Each year it looks a little bit differently, but more or less it's presented as the just very important from both national and working class point event, and everyone should identify with it because this is part of our history. So it's a little bit like presented as a neutral event without this class consciousness component, for good and for bad, because it's definitely more inclusive. It does not gather so much punishment from the central government, and we can get, for example, the people can get grants and donation to organize the event. But this is this particular case of Revolution 05, but at the same time production of both academic reportage or press articles shows that definitely the working class identity is getting back, and this component is slowly revealed. Actually, city council and their marketing policies lag a little bit behind what's happening in other places where discourse is produced. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. When you speak about German influences in housing development in Czechoslovakia, there was one during the Second World War when the example was taken in Nazi Germany. Some settlements were, like housing, were built during this period and really copied the German architecture. But after that period, during the socialist time, Germany wasn't so much taken as an example. If you look at architectural journals or for urban planning, when the country had some openness to the West, they were looking for Swedish examples or French ones, or when it was not so open, they were looking for Russian examples. But the Germany wasn't so much like quoted as an example.
Okay, if there are no more very urgent questions, then I would suggest that we reappropriate the tea and coffee break and meet back here in 20 minutes. Thank you again to you all.
Thank you very much. Yes, I call myself cultural geographer. That's my self-description, and I work on cultural landscape for like maybe 12, maybe 15 years already. So I try to put some of my research thoughts about different traveling concept of cultural landscape and its interpretations. And I will focus on semiotization as the main process, which we spoke for last 2 days a lot about the semiotization. At first, I would like to start with different turns or changes in a research approach towards cultural landscape. At first, the landscape turns or the definition of landscape. So Mike Ball has been reading about the traveling concept in humanities. Traveling, or maybe they are wandering concepts or changing concepts, and landscape is one of those concepts that's it's changed lots of its meaning. Some people say that the first word for landscape was the biblical Nov, as a kind of era seen from the hill by Moses, I suppose. I can't really remember. Then was a landscape used in Scandinavian countries. It's still in some of the countries used as the administration region. In painting, especially in Renaissance, the term has been Landschaft has been used as the part, kind of scenery in a sense. There was the German Landschaft school in geography, and the French Vidalian paysage, which was more of a region. So the landscape became a very, as we've seen in the last 2 days, rather elastic terms, or in the other form, a wandering terms, which been traveling around different disciplines, which can mean almost everything. And with terms which can mean almost everything, it's also a problem because often they mean almost nothing. They become meaningless. If we start to, if it wanders very, very far, it kind of goes to maneuvers. That happens with the popular terms, and landscape is one of those terms which has been quite popular in especially in Anglo-Saxon geographies in the last 10 or 15 years. Maybe 20 years ago, if you talk about landscaping, so generally it was about gardening or in a larger scale. If you go to a bookstore, if you still go to bookstore physically, the shelf saying landscaping, it would be how to design a park, an urban park. There was a science in Soviet Russia called constructive landscapology, Landschaftsowiedzienie, which was of course a bit different meaning. Landschaft, in this sense, was more or less as a region. And landscape becomes also a law. There's landscape convention. We've got landscape parks in Poland. So landscape can be protected, both so-called natural, if there is natural, and cultural landscape becomes a legal term now. So here we've got on the bottom picture is the place I was born, well, just outside the castle in Malbork. And the top picture is the picture from my first residence in dormitory in Gdansk, where I lived. So I kind of grew up with those landscapes as being a part of my private. I think that's almost the end of my private landscapes, even though I took most of those pictures. So I talk about landscape turns and changing in landscape. There's another culture or cultural turns. The term appeared first time, I think, in late 70s, when the meaning of culture has been changing. And also science. I mean, now we talk about culture studies. 50 years ago, we talk about anthropology or ethnography or ethnology or Volkenskunde in Germany. So the science about the people, which of course didn't mean academics. We were academics. So people were like ethnic minorities, or different types of minorities. In 1960s and 70s, women were, or black people became the subject of early culture studies. So culture evolved from, of course, cultivation, from agriculture, that's from growing. That's the German lovely word of Bildung, which also comes from the cultivation of mind. That's Cicero, I think, for the first time used culture in the metaphoric term. Then we've got civilization and art and beauty somehow in a culture, an idea. So culture can be also seen as a system of communication. That's more recent, and it's culture is always contextual. And I like the metaphor of the culture iceberg. So that's what we see, it's just the top of the iceberg. So there's another, whatever, 80% of culture is not seen, it's within us, or without our culture context or social context, or our imaginations or fears, or whatever else we can put. So this, there's different interpretations. All the pictures are kind of post-socialist, so I try to keep the post-socialist theme. That's the on the bottom there's historical picture of the former Palace of the Republic in East Germany shortly before its demolition, and then the so-called dancing house, or Ginger and Fred. And if you talk about Ginger and Fred building in Prague, I mean that's clearly a context. So if you see those buildings as a dancing couple called Ginger and Fred Astaire, it means you know the context, you know the film or a musical. And then it's probably the most important term for me, it's a semiotic term, or the semiotization. Semiotic, which is kind of giving significance or giving sense. So it's intersubjective interpretations of signs. Signs become a crucial element of the communication system, or of culture as a communication system. Yuri Lotman, the Estonian researcher, he coined the term semiosphere to add at all the geographical level to atmosphere, pedosphere, which is the soil sphere, the water, and the whatever else. He put the semiosphere on the top of that, so that the meaningful sphere of on human existence. This term is not very often used, but I think it's quite nice. I mean, all of our presentations in the last 2 days, they've been on different aspects of the semisphere, actually, of the meaningful, or giving and taking meaning to different aspects of our daily life, practically. What is important with the semiotics, it's unstable. Even I give a meaning to a place, for example, today, but in 10 days' time, I might have a different meaning to this. And if I do this, that's not really culture, because that's my psychology. That's maybe a problem with my psychotherapist. If a group of people, a culture group, gives the sharing meaning, that's culture. So if the students, the Poles, whatever, the short people, the black people, whatever the culture can be defined, if they give a joint, shared meaning, that becomes a cultural meaning. That's my favorite picture here, so showing the kind of maneuvering or flaneuring, as I like as human geographer, cultural geographer, about the changing concepts of cultural landscapes. So probably starting with the view as the kind of perspective, observation, paintings, it's all there. I mean, this is all of the discourse of cultural landscape. No, it's not all, it's a chosen part of the discourse on cultural landscape. Then there was idea, the German Kulturlandschaft was closely related with the nation and with politics and often the state. So there was the German school of Friedrich Ratzel and few others. The French, Paul Vidal de la Blache, who used the term genre de vie, and in his paysage, pays was a region, paysage was a landscape. So there was a landscape, there was a lifestyle, tradition, folklore was also there involved. Next school was the Berkeley School of Karl Sauer. He focused on materialities of culture. I will go back to Karl Sauer later on. And there's a so-called new cultural geography. I think the first term was used in 1989, which was focused on meaning. And that's the kind of signification when the narratives, interpretation, language, texts, values, and significance becomes the most important aspect of culture landscape. So if we talk about signification of landscape, so we can see as a culture as a signifying system. So in a given culture, we give different meaning to places. The place I was born, Malbork, it was called Malbork when I was born, I'm not that old, used to be called Marienburg. It was the headquarters of the Teutonic Orders years ago. But it's got a pretty different meaning for many Germans and for many Poles, and also for like Americans. That's like the biggest Gothic brick building apparently on this side of the ocean. So it depends on your culture or signifying system. You get a different layers of significance, or different signs, or different interpretation. The same sign. I would go back here for a moment. The same sign, like this is the former headquarters of the Bulgarian Communist Party when they scrabbled sickle and hammer. The symbol, the Soviet symbol of sickle and hammer, might have a different meaning depending if you are coming from, if you grew up in a communist country or socialist country, or you are coming from the West, or if you are left thinking or right radical. It's the same with Red Star, or with this visible hand of free market, which was one of the mobile company in Warsaw advertised on a Palace of Culture and Science. So landscape could be seen as a combination of form that seldom changes, and lists like spring 1945 in Wrocław. Function sometimes change, but not too often. Well, meaning always changes, sometimes from day to day. If anything happens important, could be a ritual, could be an accident. The place can get different meaning. So there's this landscape dynamism, and it's never stable, it's never fixed for granted. It's a process, not only by construction. That looks like photomontage. It's not. That's the business center in Moscow, just behind the Stalinistic, I think it's Kuznetsov Avenue, in a bit off the city center of Moscow. So of course, I think I took the picture like 3 years ago. I think it's more or less completed, or maybe there are a few more towers there. I don't really know. I haven't been to Wrocław in a few years, and I can see this landscape dynamism, not only in form, not only in functions. I couldn't find my favorite bars. I mean, physically I knew the address, but the bar is not there. But also of meaning and significance. Different things mean something different to me, or meant something different to me when I was first time in Wrocław in I know it sounds horrible, I think 4 was my first trip to Wrocław. So it was also very interesting with landscape, and most of our discussion were about this dialogue between the past, contemporarity, and the future, and our projections. That's what we would like to see. It's usually between past and present, but the future is somewhere encoded or incorporated into the present. There's many things we do for the present, actually we do for the future, with our hopes and imaginations and the other things. So if you look at this world as an arena metaphor, so the landscape can be a bit more than just stage design. It's often an actor as well. It often plays an important role. We often behave differently. We have different landscape or cultural landscape behind us. I will go very briefly through 3 major functions of landscape. So the landscape plays important roles, many roles. I've chosen 3. So it can be seen as value, as a language, of course, when societies speak or sometimes shout. That's central. Tbilisi in Georgia, when during Saakashvili presidency, there were few very iconic, emblematic buildings constructed. So there was a very clear text to the West and also to the local population that we are so Western. That's the concert hall. I think it's not functioning still. There were some technical issues, and there's a discussion about being demolished. That's presidential palace with glass couples, or lots of glass, postmodern, funky architecture, clearly a language. I have lectures of cultural landscape to my students, and I asked them if they suddenly had whatever, million zlotys, and they had to build a house from the scratch, how the house would look like. Would it be the Polish manor house in Kresy style, for example? Or would it be ultra-modern with glass and aluminium? Or will it be a hobbit's hut underground? Whatever they choose, it just tells about us, who we are. If you choose this landscape, if you have a house and you paint your house, if you can paint any color, of course, because that's where the urban planning comes and the urban compromise, which color would you choose? Electric pink, beige, boring beige, or unpractical white? Whatever. It also speaks about us. Landscape speaks about us and represents us to much extent. So one of the first and most important element of landscape is landscape, cultural landscape as identity, as an important element of visualization, showing of the identity. That's one of my favorite identity landscape places in Skopje, in central, in Macedonia, whatever is now called, I think it's Northern Macedonia is the country called now. It's not former republic anymore. So it's both of those. The big one is called the Horse Rider. You don't mention Alexander officially. Of course, cross on the top, because there's a religious discourse with the Muslims. So on every hill I've noticed in Macedonia was a huge cross as a domination. Clearly, identity very strong. Religious, national, however you can say, and it becomes a part of our identity. I mean, Agata paper on Łódź was to much extent about identities of the city, which can be seen in different aspects of cultural landscape. Second element is landscape as symbolic exchange. So it's more interwoven into political and representational system. I will speak about the representation of function of landscape a bit later. That's this is the city which used as a slogan. It's the city with the head, which is now called Chemnitz. Used to be Karl-Marx-Stadt in southern part of East Germany. So it's a form of social control. Sometimes dreams, ideas, projects. It comes out of the so this exchange of the past and towards the future through the present. The head is listed. It's protected by law. It's I think for more than 15 years. The Karl Marx monument is there. Some people say because Chemnitz has been so much destroyed, so they have not much more to be identified with. Again, it's also a part of this identity. And landscape can be also a market resource, of course. That's a small palatial village of Kozłówka near Lublin, when they've collected very few post-communist monuments in Poland, including that one of Lenin. I think that's from Poronin. I think we had like only 4 or 5 Lenin monuments in Poland, none of the Stalin ones. Fortunately, possibly. So an attractive market can be an important, an attractive landscape can be an important market resource, especially in the era of Instagramization of our travels. So the beautiful Instagrammable landscape can be a very important market resource in many aspects. And now I want to say about 4 metaphors of landscape. Starting with the geosymbol. The term was coined by Carl Sauer about the School of Berkeley in 1930s, when he said that this landscape is full of the toponyms and markers. So the imprints of culture in the matrix of landscape. That's how Sauer defined geosymbols. So the non-existing monument of Stalin, somebody mentioned earlier in Prague, the leftover of the metronome, it can be seen as or interpreted as a geosymbol of the time, or the sign of the former culture that went through. So they could be, you could get different trails and diffusions of cultures. That's how Karl Sauer followed the diffusion of the rural architecture, because he focused on rural architecture. But now we can also speak about the about urban landscape. So the Berkeley School was the kind of human modified environment. That's the flower bed in Kaliningrad, former Königsberg, very close to Gdansk. Somehow very annoyed me. I have an allergy for red stars, but that's my problem, I'm afraid. But it's also clearly a geomark or geosymbol or toponym, as Karl Sauer called them. So under influence of a given culture, the landscape undergoes development or changes. Sauer said that sometimes can achieve the final element, final stage, but I believe much more in the processual approach, so it's going further, and it's changing even further. The second metaphor for landscape is a wheel. So landscape as the as can be seen as on one hand as the aesthetic vision, certain unity with nature. Well, that's that's maybe some of you recognize. That's one of the communist Bethlehems under the star. Stalin was born in this humble stable in Gori, and the guarding dog, of course, the holiest place, the Bethlehem of communism, one of few Bethlehems. So you can of course use this Catholic or Christian metaphor of Bethlehem, of Nazareth, of sometimes Golgothas of the communist leaders, if you want to. So it operates also as the smoke screen concealing underlying truth and material conditions. So in this sense, landscape became a certain level of representation when it represents. Stepan showed us some pictures of Minsk. I will show you some others, but that's one of the picture that Minsk people see themselves. Okay, there is a part. I mean, I have one picture carefully cut, which almost look like that, with those towers of churches. But if I show it to the people who've been to Minsk, they would be really surprised to see. But that's one of the Minsk, my loved city, without any Stalinistic modernist architecture, with a clearly Baroque, Polish, Catholic houses and architecture. There's not even much of the Russian houses there, but the dominating Jesuits, churches. I mean, like, so that's how people want to represent or want to see themselves. The top picture from the Red Square, which I took, I think it also represents Russia pretty well. So it's the shop window of Cartier shop in a department store with a reflection of I think Stalin lays somewhere here in the bushes. Lenin Memorial is on this side. Sorry, that's the Kremlin. So you see this kind of melange. I think it represents Russia pretty much to some, at least to some extent. So having a Cartier shop and Stalin's grave being reflected there, it's all of the melange which represents society. So landscape can be seen as a space produced by particular fixed point of view. Of course. So when we talk about landscape, we can also speak about certain separations and observations when things are being changed. So this is the central square of Minsk with the Lenin statue. It used to be called Lenin, now it's called Nezavisnosny, whatever, Independence Square probably. That's very central, and that's the happening of in Krakow, in Nowa Huta, on the site of the former Lenin monument. They've just put this size of translucent Lenin fountain kind of thing, which of course is a representation to much extent of certain group of people in certain times. I'm not sure if that will be possible now with the ongoing government in Poland, but that's the other thing. So landscape can be seen as this palimpsest of different layers. Go a bit further, and the third metaphor, or the fourth metaphor, I think it's landscape as text. So this is probably one of the easiest metaphor. When if you only speak the language, you can read the city, the landscape as a book. If you know about architecture, a bit about history, you can walk around Wrocław, and you can probably see which building was built in 1950s, which one is kind of original, which is often early 20th century, which one was added in 2000 or whatever time. So every culture waves its world out of image and symbols, as Cosgrove and Daniels wrote. So the wheel is no longer a function. It's all about the texture of landscape, and in this texture, and when there's often those two elements of weaving past. I had this lecture on weaving past some time ago. This is central Skopje from different perspective, and the biggest building, the most amazing, it's archaeological museum, the most important, of course, since all the legitimation comes from Alexander the Great and the Great Macedonia, when Greece was a poor province, apparently. So that's how you can read the text. It's one of the ways of reading. It's not the only one. Many of those buildings have mostly facades, like you can see this one here. It's one of the governmental buildings. It's mostly a facade. It's quite narrow. It looks nice, interesting. That's how it looks like from the riverside. And don't go much behind, like in many places. So there's a construction of meaning. What is also very important, or maybe most important about text, is intertextuality. So it's a reading between texts, between different texts. So this picture, I think I took this about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago in central Leipzig, saying the people's furniture production combinate of the GDR. And now the neon, of course the VM whatever car, whatever, doesn't exist anymore, but the neon has been carefully reconstructed. And it's working, it's painted, so it's also relates to the past, and also relates to the attitude of I think of the municipality of Minsk. I don't think there was a local referendum. What should we do with that? It was just renewed, and a couple of years ago, maybe it was like 8 years ago, I can't remember. I've been in Moscow in a great agriculture exhibition grounds outside Moscow, and there was a little boy, probably from Central Asia, and he wanted to have a picture with Lenin and Bob the SquarePants as his biggest idols. Oh, you can also have a donkey from Shrek. So that's how the texts interact with each other. So for some people there is central contradiction. For some there's not. You can see this as a discursive strategy. And the last metaphor is landscape as gaze. You see, all of the pictures I've taken, it's my perspective. It's my look. I showed you what I wanted to show you. And in most of the landscape interpretation, there's this subjective knowledge or positioned knowledge, however you can call it, which locates me and the way I look, which direction, from which perspective I look. So the gaze, I think, is very important. I don't believe in transparent researchers. Maybe in mathematics, maybe in physics, in humanities. We are humans. We have gaze. We have points of view. We have the look. So it's, I think this gaze approach started with feminism and then LGBT studies, but now it went to the class discourse and many other discourses, and also even psychoanalysis. When it's quite often, especially in this kind of post-socialist studies, when sometimes the Western gaze, sometimes American gaze look is quite different. I'm reviewing now another chapter of a book, and an American view is quite different than the European colleagues, Western European, and then different than people who grew up and work in a post-communist country. And then maybe in Soviet Russia was a bit different, and it was maybe different in Poland. We don't know how different it was in East Germany, because I don't know any academics who worked in East Germany and is still working there. I think most of them disappeared from the academia scene in very early 1990s, like 1991, probably. So this perspective and way of seeing is a very important aspect of culture landscape research. So it's all about the control and domination. I've dominated Lenin in Lithuania in Gruta Park once. It wasn't very tall, so I'm not that adventurous. And on the bottom, that's the apparently the leftovers of the Stalin monument from Budapest in Sobor Park. So the landscape as the way of seeing completes with this need of and it proposes, especially of different group, not only capitalist. Yes, I'm almost finishing, and that's with this gaze comes the kind of normalizing power of landscape. So what becomes a norm? That can be also seen as a kind of Foucauldian way as control and power. That's Central Warsaw, and it became a kind of norm of the modernist city, of the prosperous Western norm, Western cities. It could be anywhere, actually. There's, even though I know some architects who said, oh, this is so specific. Yeah, because you're from Warsaw and you know where is that. So the country landscape is it's both material thing and conceptual framing of the world. Then we spoke about memories a little bit. So the historical or memory gaze. There was a time, especially like 1990s, early 2000, when I think we've been enslaved by our imagined heritages or our imagined history. That Central Sopot, the town I live, there was an original late 19th century hotel, 3 stories hotel, which was destroyed, and they built this. It was built in 1997. Historical looking, so according to this our image, that's how we want to be seen ourselves. That's Gdansk, the city I work. So contrary to what might look like, that's the oldest building from very early 1970s. That's 1990s, that's 2000. I'm really scared what come next. A cave maybe. And that's, and the top of Gdynia, it's another township just north of Sopot, one of our suburbs. And that's neo-modernist building built in early 2000, which resembles 1930s modernism, because Gdynia is such a 1930s modernist city. So then with this memory gaze, you can ask, what is remembered, for whom, why? What is the context, and who decides on that? What is, I think, important for me in this landscape discourses is the, I think Doreen Massey wrote about the relational geographies and relational landscape when they are interrelated. So it's a bit with intertextuality and those relations of different significances. That's the top picture is from Kazan, late December, a couple of years ago. Yeah, okay, Lenin looks okay, but I have a little problem with this little saying on the top, Miru mir, peace to the world. Like, oh, thank you, we have lots of peace from that side. So, okay. But that, of course, gives certain relations to me and world peace discourse during communist bloc and fighting for peace and having war for peace. Was peace propaganda was quite strong. On the bottom is very interesting building. It's a neo-1970s brutalist train station in Katowice. The original look kind of similar, has been destroyed a few years ago, and now it's been kind of partly rebuilt to resemble the early 1970s brutalist style. So it creates those places of relations for Christmas, and it's a shopping mall, train station, one of the icons of Katowice clearly. So it all creates different relations. So landscape as being something between culture and meaning, with the distance and proximity, with observing and living with the eye and the land and culture and nature, past and present, with being something special, unique. Yes, it's almost the last slide. And something vernacular, and also about our dreams, ideas, the Arcadia, the archaic landscape, the perfect landscape. If you speak with architects, their dream is to create a perfect, ideal Arcadia for people. Thank you very much in most of the cases. Well, sorry. Thank you very much, architects. No, 2 more slides. 2 more slides, no. I will be very fast now. So there's a concept again, used partly by Massey about becoming, about a processual approach. I have a little problem now with this when we mark everything as post-socialism. It's almost 30 years after. We should be more careful. Is it really still post-socialist? Is Wrocław, if you look around, is it still a post-socialist city? In which sense? In the sense that it was a socialist, so it was also post-Nazi, or post-imperial, or post-Czech city. So we should be, it's interesting to see, if we are becoming post-socialist. I think slowly we are becoming. I don't think we have reached the moment yet. And that's something, we talk about Timothy Snyder, that's my last slide. And that's his latest book, published this year, The Road to Unfreedom, on Russia, Europe, America. Probably you can put Britain, maybe Austria, maybe Italy, with this unfreedom movement. So maybe there are now being different divisions of the world. So not post-Iron Curtain, not the East or West, but those which are on the road of unfreedom, and Turkey, for example, went there quite recently, a few years ago actually, and those who are not there or not there yet. I mean, I don't know. So there may be new similarities and new discourses, which might be in a few years' time much more important, much more relevant than being post-socialist or being post-West or post-colonial. And that's the end. Thank you very much. Sorry I spoke too long.
Well, that was, I think, a very entertaining presentation.
This is what you expect from scientists.
I enjoyed it very much. However, there might be some questions or observations. Yes? Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. Thank you very much. You gave a very nice overview, about how these engagement with landscape developed past many years. Do you have any sense why a landscape, and not before? So what changed culturally in our world that takes such an age, right? So what is that? And the second question, I have a smaller question. You also use the word palimpsest, and I hear this all the time when people talk about landscape, they explore in palimpsest. Although I think most landscapes are actually not palimpsest. Palimpsest is not just a layered landscape. Palimpsest is actually layers that have no relation to each other. That is actually the palimpsest. And when you look at landscapes and layered landscapes, what makes them interesting is the tight relation between these 2 layers. All these layers respond to each other. But yeah, maybe you can say something about palimpsest.
Let's start with the palimpsest. Many of the disturbed and continuous landscape has a kind of palimpsestian. The picture which you hold in the conference is kind of a about palimpsest. Those 2 different types of urbanities not really matching each other. Probably one will disappear or has disappeared already. So it's so this relation with that's what you said. The most important, the relation between those 2 different types of feature of landscape. It's much less happens if there's continuous development. If there is distortion, if there's a gap, as we had number of gaps. It's like the war was a gap, and then after the communists came, and then 1989 was the post-communist gap. So then seeing those gaps, so then when you scratch those socialist layer of landscape, you can find very often the old bourgeois layer. So in this sense, I can see it used in those kind of disturbtive landscape, while in like landscape of Stuttgart, I'm not really sure how much of palimpsest is there. That's my perspective. And then your question, why it's
why landscape is used. And actually, I have no idea, but I have an opinion. So I think it's this anti-analytical demand for a synthesis. And landscape create a kind of everything what we see. So we've got, I mean, most of the 20th century has been very analytical. So we made a kind of very narrow analysis of one aspect of economy, of demography, of migration. In geography, we have lots of those divisions of, dozens of different geographies specializing in transport or railways or whatever, the maritime transport. And now the landscape creates the kind of regional study, but not for all region, but a kind of maybe smaller case, but focused on, but anything can be involved there. So I think in a kind of deep landscape studies. For me, your case of Loic Ablands, they could be seen as a landscape study because you focus on visibility, so everybody can see, and now everybody can take pictures. I've got like 3 cameras with me, and 2 of my telephones. I have an extra camera just in case that's something gorgeous for my Instagram or Facebook. So that's got a certain level of easiness, and then it can give a certain holistic approach to put things together that's been separated for most of the 20th century, because we had this tendency to separate those stuff.
There's a second question there.
Yeah, I'd like to push Gregor's question a little bit further.
Is it more than a coincidence that the rise of landscape as a multidimensional paradigm coincided with the rise of the postmodernist anything goes? I mean, if you listen to your presentation, there's an overabundance of possibilities, many ways to, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, there's so many things you can do with landscape. I'm going to read it, and such an overabundance of possibilities. Now, I'm here as the environmental historian on duty, and if the last 2 decades are any guide, it is that this age of unlimited possibilities is ending. We do not know how it is ending, but we are entering an age of constraints and limits. In fact, we're pretty much the last part of the world where we are not yet in that place. And it's just that the cities as the hubs of wealth, it's interesting that most of your pictures were from cities. There are landscapes outside cities too, and many of them show the constraints and the limits and the deprivations quite literally. So, to put it in a very provocative way, is the boom of landscape ending once we realize how many constraints we have in the 21st century?
That's when I started with this traveling or wandering or flaneuring concepts. So when the concepts became too big, like it was similar with culture, for example. Now we talk about the landscape, electoral landscape, which is the kind of the results of the election. So when the term became when the territory becomes too vast, then it's actually losing
That's all fair enough. Nevertheless, it seems striking, and is it easily inserted into the theoretical framework that you're interested in?
There was the old division between nature and culture, so I focused on the kind of most visible aspects of culture, which is in a built-up environment. On my lectures on cultural landscape, I showed a slide of a water reservoir and some bushes, and I asked my students, is it cultural landscape or it's not? And they tried to see something like a bridge maybe, or a little boat. No, there's nothing there. Just a bush and water. Is it cultural? Actually, the picture I showed on my lecture, it is, because that's River Jordan, and it's just on the other side of the sign which says, this is the sign near the sign when John baptized Jesus. It's, wow, this is culture. So if you add meaning to a tree, just a tree is not a cultural landscape from my perspective. If it's a holly tree, if there's the oldest tree, if there's a tree with the whatever, when Romeo met Julia, or whatever else with this kind of literature, or when Julia Roberts met whoever with actors and those mediascapes, then it becomes cultural. Yes, I come from Vistula Delta, so the hill is not my landscape. Lovely and flat, that's beauty. That's my highland. Of course, the Tatra Mountains are pretty much a part of the national identity since the meaning has been attached. So you can, okay, I chose buildings because I feel better between buildings. I'm an urbanite. But of course, fields or forests or holy trees, anything with a significance would be cultural.
Well, I think the last question over there, right.
Short question. You mentioned a few times landscapes which have a relation to the people's identity. I would like to talk about the refused landscapes when people are forced to. Maybe it's something like heterotopias, but there are many cases when people are forced to live somewhere and they live there in some environment which they refuse, and this is not only about jails and camps and so on, but
about cities, about areas, regions, and so on. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, of course, we don't have to love every landscape we see or we lived on. I mean, I can imagine somebody might hate it. I mean, my friends recently came from London. They hated it and they lived there for a couple of years, and eventually they decided to go back to Poland. So they really said, "Oh, we are not coming to London ever, ever." They just, I don't know what they hate, and there was not really identity, and I'm not sure how much was their rejection there, but I don't know, was it really a landscape they hated, or just the city and the bars and being expensive and overpriced or whatever. So I'm not sure it was much of the feeling with these friends of mine to landscape, but of course there could be like black landscape, the landscape we are ashamed of. You can talk about, I mean, there are books about the black landscape or the concentration camps or the meteorology landscapes. Or Jedwabne is a kind of the black heritage and could be a black heritage landscape in this sense. So what I'm saying, when the meaning is attached to any part of landscape, and I would like to keep landscape as the kind of visual, visible part of reality, natural or built, but has to have a meaning. And also the building, not every building has to have a meaning for everybody. Palace of Culture and Science has a meaning for almost every Pole. Some love, some hate, some still want to destroy it, but the meaning is clearly there on different layers. Thank you.